Russia comes up a lot in the news these days, and because of the Cold War, Russia and the Soviet Union still have a significant presence in our collective imaginations. But I've found that people start to draw a lot of blanks once you get earlier into Russian history. So, how did Russia come to be? Well, Russia as a region is characterized by vast swaths of open land, and by the medieval period, that meant that the area came to be ruled by an assortment of regional powers under the leadership of grand princes or grand dukes. The titles are the same thing, people just translate the same Russian word, knyaz, differently. During a period from the 900s through the early 1200s, one of these polities, ruled by descendants of Vikings, managed to conquer enough territory to form a sort of regional hegemony over these sort of pro-Russian people, and this is called the Kievan Rus. For our purposes, they have two important rulers. The first is Rurik, who is actually the immediate predecessor of the Kievan-based state, and primarily important for establishing one of the most important dynasties in Russian history, the Rurikids, who end up seated on many of early Russia's thrones, but more on them later. The second is Prince Vladimir the Great, who is famous for converting himself and his lands to Byzantine Orthodox Christianity. The story goes that he sent envoys to the neighboring major religions in his area to see what he should convert his destabilizing pagan realm to. He rejects Islam because, as he said, the Rus cannot exist without the pleasure of alcohol. He rejects Judaism because the Jews' homeland had been conquered, and so it came down to a decision between Latin and Greek Christianity. The dinky little German churches he visits aren't impressive, but in Byzantium his envoys are treated to unimaginable splendor, and a service in the Hagia Sophia. And he says, yeah, that's the one, and converts. And then he boldly asks for and is given the emperor's daughter's hand in marriage. Other Middle Eastern sources tell another story, that the Byzantine emperor needed help putting down a revolt, and in exchange for his assistance, Prince Vladimir demanded his daughter's hand, but agreed nevertheless to convert to Christianity. It was a big deal to get that marriage. Not even the German and French kings had been able to marry them. And in their eyes, Vladimir was just some northern pagan. Whatever the case, this offered the Kievan Rus a lot more legitimacy and set the stage for Russian claims to be the inheritors of the Orthodox faith and even Rome itself, with Moscow claiming the title of Third Rome after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But we haven't even reached the year 1000 yet, so the Kievan Rus are eventually subjugated and disintegrated by the Mongols, and Russia once again becomes a bunch of separate states, this time all as tributary states toward the Mongol/Tartar hordes from the east. This is called the Appanage period, and it's where Moscow starts to emerge as a preeminent Russian power. So, the way that this system works is that the leader of the Mongols picks whoever is going to be the grand princes of wherever, and the Russians send them tribute in exchange for not dying. Other than that, they pretty much leave them alone. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, or Muscovy, manages to get a deal where they would collect the tribute of all the Russian states for the Mongols and then ship it off to them. Less work for the Mongols, and Muscovy gets to skim a little off the top. That, and good favor with their Tartar overlords, allows Moscow to become a fairly prosperous city and a center of trade along 4 rivers. However, the Tartars don't keep a close enough leash on Moscow, and during a regional dispute they are defeated in a battle by Moscow in 1380 at Kulikovo Field. Now, this didn't mean independence, and the Tartars cracked down on them afterwards, but it was a sign that Tatar power was diminishing and Muscovy's was rising, and the Russian principalities start to strain more and more for independence, led in large part by Moscow. Eventually, as the hordes start to disintegrate more and have to deal with other threats, Moscow begins to distance itself from them and stops paying tribute, with the Tartars retaining control only in name, and with Muscovy, under a Rurikid dynasty, beginning to swallow up and consolidate its neighbors into a larger and larger state. The most notable and successful of these consolidators is Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. He forces the rest of the smaller Rurikid boyars to give up their land to direct control from Moscow. And boyar is just the Russian title for the small local rulers like a count or a marquis. This is important because it's the start of the famous/infamous Russian autocracy, the direct, absolute rule of the country by the Tsar in Moscow. Anyway, Ivan the Great also conquers the last remaining large Slavic state in Russia, the Republic of Novgorod, which officially brings his domain to stretch all the way to the Baltic Sea. And he also ends the nominal rule of the Tartars over Muscovy by refusing to pay any tribute and then defeating them in battle in 1480. So, Ivan III is called the Great because he tripled the size of Muscovy's territory, started consolidating power into the hands of the monarch, and ended centuries of overlordship by the Mongols and their descendants. He also started to kind of call himself Tsar, a Russification of the Latin word Caesar, Caesar, in letters to other monarchs and in some documents and that kind of thing. However, the first one to officially coronate himself as Tsar was his grandson Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. He was ruthless. As a young boy, he enjoyed torturing small animals. As an adult, he enjoyed torturing his enemies. This is where he gets his famous sobriquet, the Terrible, and by terrible, I mean the archaic English meaning feared, inspiring terror, as opposed to the modern meaning. He also believed he was on a divine mission to glorify Moscow and Russia as a new Jerusalem, most notably by having St. Basil's Cathedral built and designed in such a way to symbolically connect the two cities. Legend has it he had the architect blinded afterwards to prevent him from building anything more beautiful, but that's probably just a myth because he still built things afterward. Ivan the Terrible is an important figure in three major trends of Russian history. The first is expansion east. He's one of the most important people in this realm because he's the one to reverse the situation in Russia and instead of being subjugated by the Tatars, to start subjugating them, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Siberia, and paving the way for Russia's expansion all the way to the Pacific. The second major trend for which he is important is opening the eyes of Russia to the West. Now, Peter the Great is the most famous for this, and he certainly did the most, but Ivan helped get the ball rolling by starting to strengthen Russia's influence in trade in the Baltic region and out further toward England, France, and the West. The main thing they trade is furs, and that's a major factor in driving Russia's eastward expansion through the fur-rich region of Siberia. He hosts English merchants as ambassadors and even proposes to Queen Elizabeth a few times, to be thoroughly rejected. The third major trend for which he is important is growing autocracy and centralizing power in the monarchy. The thing to understand about Ivan IV is that he always harbored a paranoia, distrust, and hatred toward the boyars, his subordinate nobles. This is because his parents died when he was young, and so he grew up in an environment in which the boyars were viciously competing with and even murdering one another for power over him and control of his regency. His paranoia was brought back to center stage in 1560 when his wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died probably by poison, and he believed the boyars did it. To add to that, one of his key boyar advisors defected to his rivals in Poland, compromising him in a military defeat. So eventually he was pushed over the edge and decided to move out to his father's hunting lodge in the countryside, letting the Boyar Council try to rule Moscow by themselves, which they failed to do. So they asked Ivan to come back, and he agreed, but only on the condition that his powers would be vastly increased. He cut out a vast swath of the best land in Russia to be his personal domain and his alone. This land was called the Oprichnina, meaning a land apart, and within it he created the Oprichniki, which served as a sort of secret police and local government, as well as a weird sort of proto-paramilitary group that was loyal directly to the Tsar himself. They eventually came to number 6,000 strong, and Ivan used them to execute anyone suspected of treason against him. They even purged whole cities sometimes, notably Novgorod. Naturally, that meant that a lot of boyars were brutally tortured and killed, sometimes personally by the torture-loving Ivan, and those who weren't were at the very least kicked off their hereditary lands in the Oprichnina and stuck in the rest of second-rate Russia. Essentially, the boyars lost power and were firmly re-subjugated. After a time, the Oprichniki were too chaotic and had to be disbanded, so the Oprichnina was dissolved and the boyars returned, but now they were much weaker and stood no chance of contesting the Tsar's power. The story of Ivan's demise is about par for the course with his life. The devout Tsar was outraged when he saw his pregnant daughter-in-law improperly dressed, so he started beating her. Naturally, his son, not on good terms with his father, ran to his wife's aid and was in turn hit in the head by Ivan with his scepter, and died a few days later. His wife's baby miscarried, which left as the only remaining son and heir the weak Feodor, who had a short reign and no children, marking the extinction of the Rurikid dynasty and, after a brief period of civil war, the rise of the Romanovs. So, There we have it. By looking at early Russian history, we can better contextualize and understand the trends and events later on, once they really start to enter the European arena. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country today because of Prince Vladimir and the Kievan Rus. Moscow became the central juggernaut of Russia because of not just its strategic position on the headwaters of four rivers, but also due to Muscovite grand princes and their favor with the Mongols. Russia was united by the conquests of Ivan the Great and started its vast expansion eastward with the conquests of Ivan the Terrible, who also began to engage Russia with the West and whose progress there would be built on tremendously by Peter the Great. These two Rurikid rulers also took big steps toward establishing the strict Russian autocracy, and thus played a significant role in bringing about all of the rest of the crucial historical developments that would result from that.